One of our principal research questions as a leadership consultant firm was, what is it that makes people follow people? And so we took a looked at literally millions of data points across cultures, across levels, across industries from our 360 work and said, what is it that really matters? And it came down to 5 C's. Those 5 C's are competence, composure, character, courage, and care for people. They're highly interrelated. They're not things that people say necessarily, but they are assessments that you make about people. So those are the 5, but it's a research-based approach, not some slick marketing gimmick.
We believe that you are strong by design, and you were made in God's image to have a strong body, mind, and spirit. You're listening to the #1 Strength and Health Authority podcast in the world. So let's get ready to unlock your potential and transform your life in today's episode.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Strong by Design. My name is Jared. I'm one of the hosts here. It's always good to have you listening. We cover everything from faith, family, fitness, and today we're actually getting into some leadership skills and leadership developing. And something that's really important for all of us to understand is that we are all a leader at some capacity. So don't shut it off just because I said the word leadership. Understand that leadership is influence. And if you are living and breathing, you have influence over somebody. And so it's a skill that we want to help you develop. And so that's why we have this episode today. We do have new episodes every Wednesday that are releasing, and so make sure to check us out every single week. Make sure to go back. Maybe you missed an episode, and there's something back in our backlog that you want to check out. But today I have a really cool guest with me. This is a guy who we go to the same church together down here in Clearwater, Florida, and I was privileged to be invited to the staff meeting at the Clearwater campus at Grace Family. And John was invited as well, and John came and spoke, and it was an incredible topic that he was speaking on. And I said, John, I got to have you on the podcast. More people need to hear what you have to say. And John is awesome and said, yeah, I'd love to come on your podcast. And so my guest today is John. And John, I struggle through your last name every time I look at it, which is
most people do.
Yeah,
most people do.
I feel like I have a little bit of grace because I can say my wife's name no problem, which is Christiana, and everyone struggles with that.
Your wife's name is the PhD level of
names. That's right.
Yeah.
So
and you nail that one beautifully every time.
Absolutely.
I'm jealous.
So your last name,
you say it's Streitmatter.
Streitmatter.
Okay. Just like it's 2 E's.
Okay, Streitmatter.
There's a lot of letters
because the streets
it's intimidating.
matter.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
You matter to Streitmatter.
I'm never going to forget it now.
One of our kids' campaign slogans when they were running for student government was "You matter to Streitmatter."
I love it.
It's a German name, Streitmatter.
Okay.
But it has become Streitmatter over the years, and it was just easier to go with that than try to teach people German.
Did you ever call it that when you were a kid or anything?
Okay. No, I did not. No, we were talking about, we've talked about our Midwestern upbringing.
Yes.
In my part of Illinois, it's actually a very common name.
Okay.
That's where the original Streitmatter settlers, Streitmatter, settled in the mid-1800s. Mm-hmm. And as a result, there's loads and loads and loads of Streitmatters around. Okay. So that's how everybody pronounces it, and it was just easier to go with it. Streitmatter, just like it's 2 E's. It's easy.
Yeah. What was I thinking?
It's 12 letters,
trying to complicate
but very
this thing
scary
so much.
because you see some combinations you're not used to seeing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, John, I know you do a lot with leadership and leadership development. Maybe you can just give me a little history about who you are, what you do, how long you've been doing it.
Yeah.
You're from Illinois.
Terrific.
You grew up and you said, hey, I want to lead people to lead.
No, that all came
later on
through a variety of paths, as we learned a few weeks ago in church. Right, sort of the Lord's will is difficult to discern on a going forward basis, but looking backwards, it's often very, very clear.
Absolutely,
my story is the same.
Yeah,
and so I grew up in the Midwest. Did my undergrad work at Indiana University Bloomington. Worked for a few years in Chicago. Started my early career as a human resources guy, but was never really in HR. Did sort of business systems analysts, is how you would think of it,
sure.
And a marketing job essentially within the HR function. Was fortunate enough to have a guy that took an interest in me, helped me to get into business school. I went and pursued my MBA, and then postgraduate school went to work for American Express. Spent some early time in HR, and then I spent about 10 years leading customer service operations, so big call centers. And I loved that work. My wife and I came to Tampa. My wife had just a feeling that like Tampa was our place. And so we came to Tampa, said we're putting down roots here. And so I loved it when I was here. I was with Capital One at the time, spent 7 years there. They were fantastic to me, great people there. But we decided we wanted to make our home in Tampa. And so I literally offshored myself out of a job. My site was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We were offshoring it, but I knew I wanted to stay here. And so I spent a year or two sort of trying to figure out what I might want to do next. And what I discovered was that the reason that I really liked the call center work was because it gave me tons of people to coach and develop and grow. We were growing like crazy. So I had to grow leaders, had to coach leaders, had to set vision and get people aligned around a vision and a way of doing things. And we were constantly changing. And so I had to lead through change. And those were really the things that I loved. The rest of the job was just part of the job. But what I loved was those three things. And so when I offshored myself out of a job and said, well, what can I do in Tampa? What are my strengths? How do I make it work? Those were the things that I had in mind. And early in my career, I had been a client of the firm that I'm now a partner in. It's called Leadership Research Institute, or LRI. And so I reached out and the short version of that story is made the transition into leadership consulting 18 years ago.
Yeah. So you were an influencer before influencers were cool?
I guess maybe. Yeah. Well, I loved what you said. I really loved what you said about leadership is really sort of a way of being, and whether you have influence, it doesn't have anything to do with your role. And the topic we're going to talk about today, credibility, certainly shows up in leadership. But the truth is, we all carry around personal credibility, whether we're leading people or not, as well. So it's an even more fundamental topic than that. But it is the currency of leadership and influence, and whether people will follow you.
Can you develop that a little bit more? Because I think, this is really the heartbeat of what we're going to be talking about today. Is credibility and leadership credibility, and not even just leadership credibility, just credibility with other people, right? So, you and I know each other somewhat, but not a lot. But every time we have an interaction, every time we have a conversation, we're either raising our credibility with one another and our trust with the other person, or we're smashing it to the ground.
As we talked about the other day in the staff meeting, right? So let's first talk about what credibility is, right? Credibility is really, will people follow you or not, right? Do people find you credible? Do they believe what you have to say? Will they follow you or not? It is literally the currency of leadership and influence. And it functions in many ways like a bank account, just the traditional checking account, right? Where you're making lots and lots of transactions in the course of every day, every week, every month, every year. And there's good news and bad news about that, right? The bad news is that you make deposits in very, very small increments, right? To the right of the decimal point is how I like to think of it, right? Nickels, dimes, quarters. You're particularly kind to somebody, maybe that's $1.50, right? And then, the news gets worse in some respects, which is when you make a withdrawal from your credibility bank account, when you do something that people deem as not credible.
Right.
That happens to the left of
Cancel
the decimal
culture.
points. Right, we'll have a long conversation about that if you want. That happens to the left of the decimal point, often happens to the left of the comma. So you can just sort of think about the math, right? If your average deposit transaction in our credibility bank account is, 17 cents, and on average we write a $1,000 check, takes a lot of deposits to back up that withdrawal.
Sure.
Now,
do you have an example?
Sure. I'll get you one in a second. The thing I would tell you is that the good news is, I don't want to leave you hanging on the bad news.
You're good.
The good news is that you have really high transaction volume, right? Really, really high transaction volume. Literally hundreds of transactions every day, every moment. And the easiest way for us to sort of prove that concept to your listeners is to ask your listeners to honestly say, how many decisions have they made about whether they should listen to you and I talk about this topic already? They've already made 5 or 10. It's okay. We know that. We know you made that decision.
They're trying to establish if we're credible and what we're going to be talking about.
Are we going to listen to the rest of this podcast or not? That's how the world works. They've already made. We've been talking for 5 minutes.
That's the easiest way, right, on a podcast, because you can just shut it off.
Right, exactly. Yeah. They've already made 10 decisions about whether you and I are credible, right? So there are loads of examples of this. Many of them in the political arena, but a lot of them in the public arena as well. People that built sort of long track records for credibility. The one that I think of from the sport world that sort of has the most interesting appeal in some respects is, Lance Armstrong, for instance, 7-time Tour de France winner.
Canceled.
Right. Well, but also
to a degree. So
it made some bad choices.
Yeah.
Right. Like didn't play by the rules, and wrote a, figuratively speaking, $500 million check against his credibility. And maybe when he won his, third consecutive Tour de France, that was a $3 credibility, deposit. But he wrote a $500 million check by saying, actually, well, so he's an interesting story because he denied it for so long, right? So anyway, a number of figures like that. Tiger Woods is another one that comes to mind from the world of sports, right? Sort of renowned for the path he was on, broke an incredible amount of barriers, exceptional performer. Then we got a glimpse into his personal life on a couple of different occasions. And yet, Tiger's also an interesting example of how dynamic credibility is, right? We talk about that credibility bank account balance. There's really three things that are worth noting about that. The first is that it's dynamic. It changes. Your balance changes literally on an hourly or daily basis, and Tiger's a great example of that, who sort of had ups and downs, had some falls, has frankly done a lot of things to redeem himself. His work in the community, his work with underprivileged kids, he's done a lot for the good of the game in a very selfless way. So that's the first dynamic. The second is that this is what we call audience conferred. That's our consulting way of saying that the only person without a vote about whether you're credible or not is you, right? Everybody else gets to decide. You have a great deal of influence on whether you're credible or not based on what you do, what you say, how you act, and how you behave. But ultimately, everybody else gets to decide how they view that. That'll become very important when we talk about a couple of the C's, character in particular. And then finally, they're interrelated. We're going to talk about a model for credibility that we've developed as a firm over time through our research. It has 5 components to it. They can sound very clean and separate from each other. The truth is, this is a much more interrelated thing than that. When people are making an assessment about your credibility, they're evaluating a number of those C's all at once. But those are some examples that I can think of. The other examples that in the political arena that I think show the dynamic nature of it are to think about, for instance, George Bush 41 and Bill Clinton have done a number of things since getting out of office together that, again, regardless of which aisle you stood on, regardless of how you thought about their presidencies, if you looked at what they've done together to benefit the world, frankly, for not a lot of glory for themselves, there's been a lot of deposits there where, again, regardless of which side of the aisle, so to speak, you sit on, you'd have to say they put some sizable deposits in their credibility bank account, even if they wrote huge checks when they were president. Right. Either one of them. Yeah. So those are some examples.
Yeah. Human nature too. I mean, we always focus on the negative, right?
Sure.
I mean, I think about that even just I always give the example of, if Christiana gets a new haircut, she has 99 people at church tell her, man, your hair looks amazing. Right. And one person as you're walking out the door goes, nice haircut.
Yeah, what'd you do?
What's she going to dwell on? She's not going to dwell on the 99. Right. You're going to dwell on that one. And I don't know, it's human nature for us to do that.
Yeah.
And that's true with credibility, I think, too. It's hard. It's really easy to lose it, and it's hard to gain.
Yeah, it just takes longer to gain. That's exactly right. It's for my analytical friends, right? They would call that asymmetrical risk, right? There's greater downside risk than there is upside risk, right? For the social scientists, folks that are listening, right? There's a whole series of research about this positive and negative thing. I think about it primarily because of my role as a parent. And so, I won't quote the study particularly. I may not get it exactly right, but it's on the order of sort of for every critical comment that you make as a parent, you have to make 7 positive comments to sort of make up for that, right? Well, that's indicative of the nature of what you're talking about here. The same thing holds out for credibility.
My poor kids.
Right, all of them, all of them, right? I mean, there's we can podcast around kids is a whole different.
It's another rabbit hole
podcast. But the point you're making, the fundamental aspects of how we think and act as humans, fallen humans in particular, is that we can tend to focus on the negative, and it takes a long time to build up a good credibility balance. It can take a few poorly thought out steps to wipe out lots and lots of your credibility balance.
I can tell you, like, for me personally, like moving down to Tampa, because we've only been down here a couple of years.
Right.
Like I took this position at Critical Bench. I didn't realize this. I mean, I'm kind of, even just as we sit here, I'm putting some dots together that I would tell people. They're like, well, how come you're not still in ministry? Because this is the first job that I've had that I haven't been a pastor.
It wasn't full-time ministry.
And people say, why did you do that? Why are you not pastoring anymore? And I said, because I don't want to start over. And they're like, what do you mean you don't want to start over? And I didn't have words for it, but just sitting here kind of thinking about it, I'm like, it's that building of credibility again. And I'm still wrestling with it, honestly. Sure. I mean, it's an internal struggle where, we're meeting new people, and I mean, this is a completely new. I mean, well,
you're starting with a bunch of zero balances, right?
Zero balances,
bunch of zero balances, and you got to build them up.
And we have this expectation that people are going to see our past and know how credible we are.
That's right.
And Christiane and I both find ourselves frustrated or feeling like invalidated or feeling like we're not worthy enough, or all the different, all the stuff that creeps into your mind.
All of those things.
Because you think you're more credible to people than they're actually viewing you.
Yeah. Well, or you're like, look, can I just show you my statement?
Yeah.
Can I show you my statement from my last role?
Exactly.
Like, I have a really big credibility balance.
Call some people in Colorado and they can let you know.
Bingo.
But it's hard. It's hard to start that.
I hadn't
credible.
thought of that, Jared. I'm really glad you brought that up. It's a really great point about what makes transition difficult from time to time. New stakeholders, new relationships.
I'm
You're not carrying those balances.
I'm 40 in February.
Yeah.
So I'm not old, but I'm not young either.
Right.
And so to have that feeling of like, I'm not 20. And I want to be treated like I'm 40.
Right.
But it's like, I understand, I get why you don't trust me, but at the same time, can't you just,
Right.
But
I've got this big balance out there.
But that's the reality, right?
Yeah,
that's the reality that we live in, which is why we're talking about it today. It's because it's how the world works, whether you like it or not. That's reality.
Yeah, great point. I think that's a terrific point. So anyway, that's the core concept around credibility, what it is, why it matters, and some characteristics about how it works.
And so you broke it, or you did break it down. I'm guessing this comes from the company that you're a part of.
Yeah, it comes from a research base.
So this isn't something that you created.
Yeah, we didn't just make it up. We didn't just make it up and say, hey, it'd be really catchy if it came up with 5.
We had trustworthy, and it wasn't a C, so we threw it out.
Exactly.
So 5 C's of credibility, and so we're just going to dissect and go through those.
Great. Yeah, so the 5 C's of credibility, it really comes from, as I mentioned, our firm, Leadership Research Institute's been around for 30 years. We were one of the early pioneers in what was then called multi-rater feedback, what people today would call 360-degree feedback, right? Developmental feedback from all the people in your orbit. And one of our principal research questions as a leadership consultant firm was, what is it that makes people follow people? And so we took a looked at literally millions of data points across cultures, across levels, across industries from our 360 work and said, what is it that really matters to folks? And it came down to 5 C's. Those 5 C's are competence, composure, character, courage, and care for people. And so we'll talk about all of those: competence, composure, character, courage, and care for people. Those are the 5. They're highly, as you can tell just from listening to the names, They're highly interrelated. They're not things that people say necessarily, but they are assessments that you make about people. So those are the 5, but it's a research-based approach, not some slick marketing gimmick that we came up with.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from.
Yeah. So number 1, competence.
Yeah. So competence has 2 components to it. We think of them as technical competence and managerial competence, right? This gets to that piece about leader in a minute. But first, technical competence, pretty straightforward. We have an easy concept of that one most times.
Can you do it?
Do you know what you're doing? Right? If you're a lawyer, do you know the law? If you're an engineer, do you know how physics works? Do you know how forces works? Do you know how whatever it is? Chemistry, if you're a chemical engineer. Do you know physics if you're a mechanical engineer? Fluid dynamics if you're a thermal engineer or something like that.
I know none of those.
Yeah, I don't know any of them either, but I know that you have to know them to get those certifications.
I saw that was funny that those are the examples you pulled.
Well, those are the ones that I think of because they're the ones that people think of as being the most technical kinds of things.
Yeah, that makes
sense. Right? A few of my clients are actually rocket scientists, right?
Okay.
And so, like, if you're going to be a rocket scientist, you actually have to know how rocket science works.
How to not blow yourself up.
Aerospace engineering and things like that.
Yeah.
They matter. So that, and again, those are fairly easy to get your arms around for most people. And then managerial competence is really just, do you know how to manage situations? And notice the difference between managerial competence and leadership, right? Leadership in many ways is a set of behaviors, can also be thought of as almost an emotion that's evoked from a person. Managerial competence is really, do you know how to manage and lead people? What that often looks like is, can you set expectations? Do you know how to help people know where they stand? Do you know how to help people build their skill? A little bit of teacher in managerial competence. And do you know how to deal with consequence? And consequence has a negative connotation, and certainly that's true, right? If people aren't performing, do you know what to do? But the truth is, a big part of managerial competence is, do you know what to do when people are awesome? Right? When people are fantastic, when you set expectations and you coach people and you develop them and they just blow you away with what they accomplish, do you know what to do? How do you handle that? Do you know how to expand their scope? Do you know how to increase expectation? Do you know how to build partnership with them? So those are the skills. For your listeners that are interested in learning more, particularly around managerial competence, Google has done what I think is the best work at what is it that makes a good manager. And again, I separate manager from leader.
So you're saying that manager is a subset of leader, or leader is a subset of manager?
Manager, in many respects, is a subset of leader, I think.
It's a skill of the leader.
In this framework, we're talking about managerial competence as, do you know how to manage people? Do you know how to get people to get behind a task, accomplish a task, set expectations, those sorts of things?
It's a weird one for me when I think about the difference between technical and manager.
Right.
Because a lot of times when I want you to address this because I'm curious your answer. A lot of times when it comes to like managerial leadership, it can come across as, I don't do anything anymore. I don't want to do the work. I just want to delegate to other people so that I can sit around and read my book, do whatever I want to do on my own time. I don't even know, and maybe you can.
I have a great example for that.
Yeah. So maybe help explain that, because that transition is difficult for someone to make of, hey, I know how to do this thing, but now what do I do with my time? If I delegated it to you and now I'm asking you to do it, now what do I do with my time?
Yeah. So I'll talk about a couple of things as it relates to that. The example that I would share, let's talk about two examples. One's a little more conceptual. One's real from my own life, where we see it most often in sort of academia or in the really technical disciplines, where someone is just the world expert at some sort of technical domain. But you ask them to lead a research team and the team falls apart. Or they're an incredible research professor. You ask them to lead a class and teach people through what they've learned, and that's a disaster. We sometimes see that in even things that we think of as being less technical, but they have technical skills to them. Sales is one, right? We're all familiar with somebody that was a phenomenal salesperson.
Michael Scott.
That then be that's a whole other conversation, right? That became.
It's my new goal to see how many times I can get you to say that on this episode.
I like another conversation. Yeah. You're looking for more podcasts. I'll come back as often as you want. I got lots of stuff to talk about. But the salesman, that's a salesperson, that's a fabulous salesperson that suddenly becomes the sales manager and really struggles to get other people to be excellent salespeople because they're just either they were naturally good at it or they did it and they can't teach it to anybody else. So there's lots of examples we can think of where technical competence is really high, managerial competence is really low. There's some other examples where maybe managerial competence can be high, but technical competence is missing. And for me, that was my first real leadership job. I took over a business travel center. Had about a 200-person travel center, and I was by no means was I a superstar managerially, but I knew enough to be able to set expectations, manage goals, talk to people, had good relationship skills. I wasn't a superstar, but I knew enough. My downfall was that I didn't know the travel business at all, and so just the core system, like how do you make a reservation? That the system at that time still is today. Actually, was one of the reservation systems was called Sabre. It has a number of characters. There's a pillow. There's a bunch of other characters that just don't exist on a keyboard even, but they exist in Sabre. I did not know that system, and I didn't really know the travel business. And so when I tried to lead change and tried to move things forward, I didn't really know what I was talking about. My people knew that. And when they would raise concerns, I didn't really know what concerns were legit and what concerns were just natural resistance. And I failed in that job. We feel that too as in leadership, right? If I ask you to do something and you're resisting it, it feels almost like disrespectful. It can, right? Yeah. And from my perspective, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to help people move through change, and so I know what resistance looks like. I know it's meaningful. One thing that I would say about change here is, right, if you're leading a large scale change and you're not encountering a bunch of resistance, you should be terrified, right? Because one of two things is happening: either nobody's actually changing, or two, there's a whole bunch of resistance going on and you don't know anything about it. Right. And so for me, I expected resistance. What I didn't have was the filter to say, is this a real problem? Or is this just resistance that I can help people navigate and get over? And I just didn't know because I didn't have the technical competence to know enough to make it work. And so that was a case where, again, managerial competence wasn't super high, but it was high enough. Well, the problem was technical competence was below the minimum. And as a result, there was no way for me to be successful in that job. And I realized it way too late. And again, a different story for a different day. But I share that because, again, we often think of examples where there's technical competence exists, but managerial doesn't. We don't think about it as often on the flip side. And for me, that's how that came to be true. And then one last thing that I would say is about managerial competence is, in many ways, what managerial competence is about is figuring out what is it that I need my followers to do, and then how do I help clarify what I expect, and then the tricky part is how do I modify what I'm doing with them to give them the best chance. You used the word delegate earlier, right? And so in the model of leadership that we teach at LRI, what we would say is, look, if somebody's high skill, high will for the task that they're doing, then by all means, delegate to them. But if they're not, delegating is not the right style, right? Sometimes you have to be fairly directive. Do this, then check with me. Do this, then check with me. Those are pretty radically different managerial styles, right? Do this, check with me, do this, check with me, and hey, you got it, run with it, go with it. But effective managers have to do both of those and everything in between. That's what managerial competence really looks like. Can you clearly articulate what needs to be done? Can you assess what your people need from you to be successful? And then can you give them what they need to be successful? And then whether they're successful or not ultimately is up to them. Yeah. but you have a big part in whether you'll help them to achieve
the
that.
idea with the managerial competency would be where I could only do this small amount of work on my own. Now when I step back, now I'm feeding into 20 people to do the exact same thing, but on so that I can cover a larger scale. And so what you're doing with your time is you're going to each person and making sure that everyone is equipped, because everybody's different.
That's right.
Has what they need.
That's exactly right. And that part can be really confusing
This is my little pen.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. That can be really confusing to people because, it's easy to, and we're going to talk about fairness when we get to, particularly to character, right? And people say, well, you should treat everybody the same. And my response to that is, actually, to me, that's patently unfair.
Right.
Because people have different needs. People have different desires. So what I would say is be consistent in the approach that you use to help people, but you may delegate to one person. You may be pretty directive with another person. You are being consistent in your desire to help both of them be awesome. You're being consistent in your desire to efficiently use your time, but you actually treat them differently.
Right. And
you got to have a framework for doing that.
That's a little foreshadowing of 5C.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As we move through the process, that's right. So anyway, that's competence, right? Technical competence, managerial competence. You have to know your stuff technically. You need to know enough to be able to manage and lead people. Know enough about how to set expectations and provide feedback. And that's really what competence comes down to.
Yep. So then we have competence next.
Yeah, composure.
Composure
is the one that we'll talk about next. And composure, we define as the appropriate emotional response. Right?
What are you talking about?
Right, exactly. We're emotional people, right? And so there's a difference between demonstrating emotion and what we think of as like being emotional, right? Being emotional in some respects is a synonym for, behaving irrationally or something like that, right? Demonstrating emotion, being empathetic, being compassionate, being sympathetic, being excited, those are all those are all emotions that we demonstrate as long as we demonstrate them appropriately. And so that's what that one really looks like. Here, let me give you a very simple example that helps to explain that. I was on a plane flight once, and we're flying. Cockpit door opens. The pilot comes walking down the aisle, leans over right at the exit row, looks out the window, and turns white. So I can't remember whether he said like, "Oh no" or not, but it was clear that something was not right. Turned around and walked briskly towards the cockpit. He didn't really say anything, but we were all watching. We were all watching that pilot, right? Same thing happens when you experience turbulence on an airplane. Who do you look at? You look at the flight attendants, right? Well, when things happen in your world, people are looking at you.
I'm calm.
That's exactly right. What is the appropriate emotional response? So that's an example for what that looks like. The other.
Did you survive that plane?
I did.
Okay.
I did. I don't even actually now recall what was wrong with the engine, but I do recall being pretty freaked out.
Sure.
When the pilot came down, looked out, and sort of. We were all looking. At him, and it was clear that he was not happy with what was happening.
We have a local weatherman here in Tampa. His name's Dennis Phillips.
Oh yeah, sure.
You know Dennis, and I'm always like, hey, if Dennis is worried,
that's right.
Jared's worried.
That's right. But if he's not,
I'm good.
Don't be. That's
a
great example. I love Dennis and the fact that he says that.
His is rule 7.
Exactly. I like
don't freak out until I tell you.
Don't freak out until I tell you to freak out.
That's right.
And then I do.
That's right.
Take action. Yeah, precisely. So just saying the word composure, right? One of the things that people can sometimes mistake about that is that we need to be, calm, cool, and collected all the time. What I would suggest to you is it's appropriate to be calm, cool, and collected when that's what is the appropriate emotion for the situation. If those around you are losing their heads, and you need them to be calm and rational, obey orders, think through things, well, then you want to be calm, cool, and collected. But there are times when that's not the appropriate emotional response. The best example I can think of is when I spent some time at SunTrust Bank. Southern Bank, very well led, regional CEO, was a guy straight out of central casting for what you think a banker should look like, right? And a great
business suit, bald, and glasses.
right? Great. He had hair, but everything else was exactly as you described. And he was a great guy. Still is a great guy. But he was as sort of straight down the middle as you can think of. But I also saw him, be on stage, sort of making a fool out of himself in a Hawaiian skirt during a skit when we were having a program to recognize our top sales performers, because that was the appropriate emotional response. I'm grateful for what you've produced. I'm excited about what's ahead. We've all seen that happen, and so that's really what it looks like. The so what for your listeners here is that the way to demonstrate composure is you have to be able to sort of respond to situations rather than reacting to situations, right? Often where we lose composure is where we just, our amygdala, literally the neuroscience is, you're right, your amygdala gets hijacked and you react instead of responding. And so there's really a couple of ways to think about how do you keep that under control, right? The first is take care of yourself. Take care of yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, right? Things like quiet time, things like being part of a church community, things like being part of groups. Those things are part of what help you to maintain perspective. But no, they did not.
Oh, okay.
That's not a paid promotional announcement. It really is true, right? It's an interesting intersection of the science of leadership and my own personal spiritual beliefs, right? But having that foundation and perspective and being well in whatever respect you can think about are a really, really big part of that. And then the second piece of that is in many respects knowing how to just manage stress, right? Like, how do I manage stress? How do I manage it when I'm in an elevated stress situation so that I can respond instead of reacting? But the best advice I can give folks for dealing on the composure front is to be well, holistically well, take care of themselves, be rooted in things so that they can maintain perspective even when things look different, so that they can make a choice about what do I think is the appropriate emotional response here.
I worked at a company called PrEP. It was Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program. And talking about how the amygdala will take over even in a relational deal. And so the entire time you're talking, I keep hearing the video in my head say, they called them Amy and Flo.
Oh,
how do you get Flo to take over when Amy's trying to drive? And so,
that's exactly
reality.
how it plays out. Yeah, that's exactly how it plays out. Even things as simple as finding your own triggers for, I can feel myself starting to react. How do I buy myself some time? Somebody asks you a particularly pointed question. Maybe it's a loaded question. Maybe it's a completely unfair question, right? A leading question that just contains loads of falsehoods in it, right? Taking that extra 2 seconds to respond can be what makes the difference in a composed response versus what looks like it's not composed, right? And again, we see lots of examples of this in the public light. Sadly, oftentimes what we see on social media is people at their worst because they didn't demonstrate the appropriate emotional response, right? We talked about pilots earlier. We've seen lots of people on airplanes doing just absolutely, completely, totally irrational things, right? Because they lost their composure.
Right.
They were stressed out, they were tired, they were worried, whatever they were. Something happened. So that's what composure looks like. The interesting thing about composure, Jared, is that, particularly those of us that are sort of rational types would like to think that competence is the thing that we think about first, right? The truth is composure is what we think about first. It's what we feel about other people, right? And so that's why it's so important for leaders to know how to demonstrate empathy when that's what's required, to know how to demonstrate excitement and demonstrate joy and be willing to communicate joy. Be willing to communicate sadness.
I think Paul says something about that, doesn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. Which just to reference it, right?
Yeah.
I don't know where he says it. I'm just pulling it out of out of my brain
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
But basically, he says, cry with those who are mourn with those who are mourning, and have joy with those
who are,
who are joyful. Knowing how to emote with those, and how they're feeling.
Yeah, yeah, and even in darkness, joy in the morning, right?
That's right.
So being competent in that full range of things is people. That's what people assess about you first.
Yeah.
And if what they see is that you sort of are demonstrating the appropriate emotional response, that not only do they sort of think that you're behaving in the ways they'd like to, but they feel you behaving in the ways that you'd like to, then they're willing to stick around to see if you have the other 4 C's.
Yeah. Romans 12:15.
There you go. There it was. That was you pulled that quickly.
That's right. Thank you, Google.
Yeah, that's right. You pulled that really fast. So that's what composure is, right?
Yeah.
Demonstrating the appropriate emotional response.
Yeah.
Be excited when it's time to be excited. Be calm when it's time to be calm.
I think when it comes to credibility as well is that we're going to respond to other people's composure differently as well. So
No question.
We did that exercise, where you shared a similar story, but everybody in the room is, we had a long conversation about was their reaction appropriate or not, and
Right.
and different people have different and so you're not going to appeal to everybody
Sure.
ever.
That's right. That's right.
I used to think you're not going to appeal to everybody all the time, but the reality is you're not going to appeal to everybody ever, because everybody has their own own
exactly
perceptions,
right.
their own view on the situation of what's going on, and you could have half the room think, yeah, they're doing everything correctly, and the other half is going, what's wrong with him? Why isn't he responding?
That's precisely right. Yeah. We'll talk about that when we get to character a little bit too, about the importance of values and how that works. Because the nature of credibility is it's audience conferred.
So-
right? So there's a wide range of how people are going to respond to you.
Within that idea and understanding, how do we determine if someone has that credibility or is a good leader? How do we determine if their response was emotionally correct or not?
Yeah.
Like, what's the discerning factor?
It's a lovely question. And I don't know that I have a terrific answer for it, other than to say we feel it, right? We know how people feel. Maya Angelou once said, right, people won't remember what you know, they'll remember how you've made them feel. She's right. That's absolutely a demonstration of composure, right? Do I feel like you responded the right way? We've all had a situation where we shared something, whether it was in group or whether it was just in a conversation with a friend, right? Where, somebody said, hey, how you doing? How you doing today? And instead of everything's great, you say, well, I'm having a tough day. And they just kept right on moving as if they hadn't heard it. Right?
That's sad for you.
Well, I mean, we've all had it happen, right?
Sure.
We've all had it happen. We felt that in some way.
Yeah.
That was a credibility withdrawal. Now, it may have only been $5 worth of a credibility withdrawal compared to the $1 million ones we've been talking about. But it was still there, right? But it was in the way that it felt.
Yeah. 2022, I think you mentioned, that was right at the beginning of our conversation. You were talking about hindsight, right? And how it's always easier in hindsight. Obviously Hitler had a lot of influence, and a lot of people were following him. And in hindsight, you say, well, I guess maybe his leadership was actually really good. He just, his morals and his value and his, all of these other things that we're talking about.
Sure. You could say this, you see that, frankly, all over the political landscape, not just in the U.S., but around the world, right? Where sort of followership doesn't necessarily mean that you're on the right track, doing the right things, doing good, right? We'll talk about that when we talk about character. But I think you asked a great question. How do you know that you made a deposit on the composure front? And the truth is, that determines based on how somebody felt in your presence and how they felt about your response. It's often the one area where I personally have seen this play out is particularly around sort of really bad news, right? When somebody's got a health situation, somebody's telling me about a situation that they're in. I'm a problem solver. And so my natural inclination is to try to solve the problem. what I've discovered over time is that's often not very helpful at all. That's a withdrawal, right?
That's the case with my wife.
There you go. Well, right. There's a whole bunch of male-female things we could get into there, but
that's a conversation for another time.
That's right. That's a conversation for another time. See, look at that. But how that plays out for me, right, is what I've learned is saying something like, I don't even know what to say. I'm really sorry to hear that. And I really feel for what you're going through. Feels wildly inadequate to me. It feels terrible, even as I'm saying it to you, and it's not even a real conversation we're having, right? But to the other person is the appropriate emotional response. You were honest enough to say you don't even know what to say, and you're demonstrating to me that you care about me by doing it anyway.
I think validating how somebody feels is huge. I know in pastoral ministry, I don't feel as bad about it anymore because I think I've done it so much, especially with someone who, someone just passed away, or they found out they're very sick, or, all kinds of different situations. I mean, that's care ministry. That's what it is. You're always running into the train.
Precisely.
And so for me, I had a really wise pastor who mentored me, and he talked about the ministry of presence.
Nice.
Where it's not the ministry of having the right thing to say, or even pulling out the Bible and giving a scripture.
Just be there.
Just being there.
Love it.
And I carried that with me. I continue to carry that with me. Just the value of just being present in that moment and validating how that person is feeling, and to say it's okay. Like if someone's like, I don't get it, why would God do this? And to say, I don't understand either. It doesn't feel fair.
Right.
And I'm sorry.
Just be there.
It sucks. What you're going through sucks. And so I think that there's a lot of value there that people don't. Like you said, I think that the normal response to that is, well, I'm not helping anything.
Right.
But you are.
Yeah. Well, and it's not up to you, right? It's the other person gets to decide.
Exactly.
Well, and I think you made I don't want to go too far down the path, but you made a terrific point about the importance of presence, right? Just being fully present and fully focused on someone is an incredible demonstration of the appropriate emotional response, right? Composure, to just be fully there for someone. Where I see that come to mind is often people tell me, I'm really bad at remembering names. And what I often say to them is, well, that might be true, but I think it's more likely that you're just really bad at getting names because you're not being fully present when you meet somebody, and so it never even went in your head. And that's one of the things that I've worked really hard on. I'm known for knowing people's names, right?
I did not know that.
I am, okay. And it's not because I'm great at remembering names. It's that I have learned over time, through screwing it up lots, that when I meet somebody, I need to be fully present.
And they
completely undistracted.
People's response when you see them later and you call them out by name, and they're surprised that they're like, "Oh my gosh, you remembered my name."
Right. And again, it's not because I have a better memory than anybody else does. It's not the point. It's because I was fully present in the conversation, and therefore it was easier to remember. But I think your point about presence is a great one, right? That a big part of demonstrating the emotional response is just be fully present. And be in the moment, in whatever that moment is. That's a lovely point.
Yeah. So that leads us to character. And so character, I think there's a couple of important distinctions to make here. I would define character as do your actions match your stated beliefs and values. Is there a correlation between character and integrity?
Absolutely. Okay. They're exactly the same. Okay. Right? Think of all the words that have the same root word as integrity, right? Integer, integrated.
I even forgot that you said this. That's okay. I didn't. That was just a natural thing that we got to. I'm sorry. Continue.
No, it was beautiful. It was a beautiful, beautiful lead in, right? Integrity, integral, integrated, integer, whole number, no remainder. 3.0 is an integer, not 3.0000001, right? It's completely whole, unified, without loose ends. That's exactly what character is, right? People think they know who you are based on what you said you believe and what you have over time shown them? Do you behave in ways that are consistent with who you are and what you say you stand for? Now, there's a very important distinction here, which is there's a connotation, right, of character that can sound like, do you have the right values? Let's just take that whole right values concept for a second and true it up to, this is an audience-conferred phenomena. Well, if the person gets to decide whether you're credible or not, sort of by definition, there's a wide variety of values that those people hold. Yet you can still be highly credible with people across a wide spectrum of values if you make the connection between what you believe and how you behave. Because if you don't, they're judging your behavior based on whether you behaved according to their values. Well, by definition, you can't win that because values are as widespread as there are people. And that's really the action item for leaders is, and for anybody really is, particularly as leaders where we have to make decisions. Oftentimes where character comes to the front is when we have to make decisions, whether that's a policy decision, whether it's a decision about a particular person, a performance issue that we talked about earlier. We often spend, as leaders, a lot of time explaining the decision. What did we decide? What we don't do as often, and what we need to do to make the character thing work, is to, we call it link and label, right? Make direct connections between, here's what I believe. You've heard me say that over time. I say I stand for X, Y, or Z. Therefore, this is the decision that I've made because it's consistent with that value. The one that I think that's the most easily accessible and yet most widespread is like around safety, right? Like if you're a company or an organization or whatever that says, hey, safety is our first priority, and yet you're deferring routine maintenance, you don't actually do your safety checks, you let certain policies slide over time, that's a demonstration that you're not actually behaving in ways of your values. And the example I have with that is I worked with a utility company in Jacksonville, and they talked about how safety was their number one priority. But I had heard lots of people talk about that. What was striking about them was that they started every meeting that I was ever in with them, whether there were 3 people or whether there were 300 people, every single meeting that ever happened at that company started with a safety briefing. Where are we? Where are the exits? Who's in charge of calling the ambulance? Calling 911 if there's an emergency. Right? There was a script, but they did it every single time. You could not spend any appreciable time in that organization and not walk away with the belief that when they said they cared about safety, they meant it because of how they acted. Right? And so that's what this looks like, right? But my personal one where I see it go out the window is I'm a bit of a car guy. And so, right, there was a period there, and I happened to be in Richmond when CarMax first came to be about. First CarMax store was in Richmond, and their deal was one price. And they were good at it. They did it. They meant it. But a lot of car dealers sort of went, oh, hey, there's something to this one price thing. But what happened was a lot of dealers said we're one price. But if you pushed them, they'd come off the one price and negotiate. And as soon as they thought they were doing that in a way to sort of build relationship and, hey, you get a special deal, and that was a good thing. That was a deposit. I had that happen to me on a couple of different occasions, and I'm like, well, that's it. I'm done with this dealership. I'm not coming back ever again.
The exact same experience.
Did you?
Yeah, there's this commercial in Denver, and they say, one price, one person, 1 hour. And I'm like, sweet. I was there for like 2 hours.
Right.
I had lots of prices. And in the end, like the guy was still in the back doing who knows what. Right. I'm like, I'm done.
I'm out.
I'm out and I'm never coming back.
That's right.
Because everything that you told me was going to happen when I came in the door did not happen.
That's right. That was a several $100,000 figuratively credibility withdrawal.
Yeah, it was
Perfect example.
Horrible.
Right? You say you're this, do you do it? And so again, for for us as people, again, whether we're in a leadership role per se or not, the question to really think about is, A, do people know what you stand for? Because if they don't, they're judging you based on their yardstick, not yours. And that may not be a good thing for you, because they may have very different perspective on how the world works than you do. And then secondly, do you, from time to time, and particularly when you're making decisions that are different than what you think they might make, do you very clearly help connect, this is what we say we stand for, with here's what I'm going to do today? Again, the safety one is the one that I can think of. Another example was in my call center days. We had very defined schedules, right? If you're going to have a 700-person operation that answers the phone, you got to have certain people that work certain hours that matches up with when people call. And but when you work is a really important thing to you as the individual, right? And so the way that I resolved that was I was the guy that on 2 different occasions changed the sort of the rank ordering of how you bid for your shifts from seniority based to performance based. Now, even as I say that, some of your listeners are saying, "Well, that's not fair," and just hang with me for a second, right? Those of you that are out there thinking that, right? Just hang with me for a second, because my belief was that a couple things were true in that situation. One, somebody has to work overnights. Somebody's got to work on the weekends. That's when people call. We have an obligation to be there for our customers, right? Number 2, who that person is less relevant to me as the leader. 3, I know it matters a lot to the person who's working when they work. And so, if those 3 things are true, then the best thing that I can do for a leader, if I say I really care about my people, is give my people as much control as possible over when they work. And what I would say is, you have way more control over how you perform than you do whether you were hired before your colleague or not, right? That you didn't have any control over that.
Yep.
You have control over how you perform. And so for me, that's how I talked through that change was, look, for me, this is very simple. We're running an organization that's got some very fixed constraints. You care a lot about a particular variable. I want to give you as much control over that variable as I can. Yeah. And that's how we do this.
Christiana worked for a coffee company in Colorado. Mm-hmm. And she'd been there for a year, and the manager left and went somewhere else. And I mean, Christiana's in her 30s.
Right.
And she's working with teenagers.
Right.
And, but the owner instilled the manager based on seniority and not based on skills.
Yeah, right.
And I remember both of us just like, you've got to be kidding me.
Being dumbfounded by it.
Yeah,
right.
and she's like my general manager is like 17 years old.
Right.
And then I'm 32 or whatever.
Yeah,
and it's like, but that's how she operated, and it didn't matter if they were good, bad. If they had been there longer,
well, and that's the key.
Had the
right? That's the key, right? In the organization I was in, right, we were a very young organization. We had the opposite. We had that same situation play out, but not from a seniority perspective. But like, hey, look, if the person who's the best at the job is 17, then give them the job,
right? Which would have been fine
if that was the case. That's performance based, not seniority based,
exactly.
right? Anyway, my point in that whole story is that we could have different perspectives on whether you should be assigning shifts by seniority or by performance, et cetera, right? What I hope people would take away is that I had a clear set of things that I believed. We have to answer the phone in a certain period of time. I want to give as much control as I can. I think you can control this variable more than that other variable, and therefore, how you determine your shift should be driven by performance, not seniority, right? That was at least consistent. There may still be people on your podcast that are, after having listened to us talk through this, say, I still think you should do it by seniority. And that's okay.
They're wrong.
They may,
it's okay.
No,
I'm just teasing.
They may think that, right? What I would hope they would say about me is, I don't necessarily agree with him, but he behaved consistently to what he said he stood for.
Right.
He has high character. Yeah. He might be wrong, but he's not dishonest, lacks integrity, two-faced, whatever, right? Like he did what he said he was going to do, even if I don't agree with what he believes.
Yeah, he did what he said he was going to do, and also he lives up to the standard that he requires of other people.
Right. Yeah.
It really. If you're asking people to be performance-based,
that's right,
and you're lazy doing your job, then that's going to be a hard on people as well. Like, well, if it's performance-based, then give me your job. That's right. Because you're not doing anything anyway.
That's right. You know? That's right. A simple example, another simple example of where I've seen this play out in the corporate world in particular, right, is, back in the days when everybody was in the office and open offices were the thing, right? And we said, hey, look, we're going to get rid of offices, we're going to get rid of cubes, all that sort of thing. And then you have the conversation with the senior executives, and they'd be like, well, I mean, like not for us. We're like, well, do you believe it or do you not believe it? If you believe that collaboration works better, then you have to do the same thing. Reserved parking's another one, right? Like, we should get rid of all the reserved parking spots. It promotes hierarchy. We ought to go. Okay, great. Well, we're going to get rid of all the parking spots. We're like, well, where's my spot? But you don't have one. Remember, we said we're going to reserve parking for everybody. We're all team members here. We're all the same. And so wherever you start to see sort of 2 sets of rules or 3 sets of rules where there isn't a clear understanding of why that works, that's when people are making decisions that say that lacks character.
I've been to a couple of churches where they have a parking spot and it says reserved for the pastor's wife. And I'm like,
wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've never been. Yeah. That's not a church I would frequent. It
was interesting.
Right? Unless I knew the reason why.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, hey.
Right? But you get the point.
Maybe she's pregnant.
Make sure people know what you stand for.
Yeah.
And more importantly, when you're communicating decisions, particularly the more controversial decision, the more important it is to draw a direct linkage between, remember, this is what we said we stood for. Remember, this is what we said, how we're going to do things. This is us doing what we said we were going to do. Think about those safety briefings at that utility company, right? Great. If safety is our first priority, then every meeting needs to start with a safety briefing, period.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, you're sending a signal that says it isn't.
Awesome.
So that's what character is about. Notice that that's way more dynamic than we think.
Sure.
Right? We tend to think people have character or they don't have character. That's completely false. It's based on how we interact. And you can think people. It's one of the things that's the most frustrating to me about the American political environment at present is there's just in my opinion, there's been a complete collapse of those, right? Like if you believe something different to me, then you don't have character. That's not at all fair, like at all. We wouldn't want them to think that about us, right? You may think something completely different than me, but if you behave in ways that are consistent with what you say you believe, I have to at least give you credit for that. Now, I ought to be talking to you about why do you believe what you believe, and I can seek to influence why you think what you think. But what I can't do is sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Yep.
Because we wouldn't want people to do that to us either, right? Just because I believe something different than you.
That's because I'm right and you're wrong.
Right. Well, there's a whole bunch of that, right? And so that I think I would really challenge your listeners and your viewers to think about. Are you making assessments about what you think is right or wrong? Or are you paying attention to, does that person do what they say they stand for? And if they do, then you can talk to them about what they believe, but let's not say they have low character, because that's not the assessment you'd want them to make of you either.
So character does not equal morality.
That's correct. It's a different gig.
Yeah. All right, 2 more.
Yeah. So we get to courage, right? Courage. We would define courage as the willingness to voice an unpopular opinion or to be decisive, right? And there's sort of 2 parts to that, right? That being decisive in many ways is a combination of all of these things together. I find that one of the very best ways to be courageous is to have a really big credibility bank account balance, right? To have people know that your character is unassailable. Then you can have courage to do things, because you can say things like, I don't know whether this is going to work or not, but I believe these things to be true, and therefore I'm going to make this decision because it's consistent with what I believe. And if I'm wrong, then I'll come back to you and tell you I was wrong and change my mind. And people will believe you because you have a high character bank account balance, right? That's, in my opinion, that's the very best way to be decisive, is to have a really strong character bank account balance where you can make mistakes, and people will grant you the grace to and believe you when you say you made a mistake. The second part of that is around voicing an unpopular view. It's hard to be the lone voice, right? Like, to be the one vote in a 8-1 vote is really, really challenging, right? And so, one of the tactics for people to do that is to just be clear. Comes back to that character piece too, right? Be clear about what is your concern. And look, here's how you could get me to be a yes, right? Like I want to go where you're going. I support you. I value you as a person. I value you as a leader. For that reason, I owe it to you to tell you that I don't agree, and here's why. Again, it's a demonstration a little bit of character, but that's different than just whining and complaining.
Right.
I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like this. You're wrong.
I think the phrase that stuck out to me was disagree without being disagreeable.
Disagreeable. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. You can disagree without being disagreeable. Right. Like, look, I respect you. I respect that you have a different point of view.
Yeah.
I'm not there.
Yeah. That's one of the things with conflict or with arguments that I always try to help people understand as well is what's your end goal?
Right.
Like, is your end goal just to win?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that because if that you're going to fight different if the you're going to bite and pinch and all kinds of stuff. But if the goal is actually, hey, let's partner together and move forward. Like I say this in marriage all the time.
All the time.
Right? All the time.
That's a great
like,
example.
You guys, it's not you coming and fighting against each other. It's you coming alongside of each other to fight the problem together.
Yeah.
And if that's true, you winning over them is not actually completing the bigger goal.
That's right.
And so it's understanding the bigger picture and being able to step back and say, I disagree with you, but I'm on your side.
Right. Well, and you can see how if you sort of conflate the I don't agree with your values and beliefs, and you don't have high character. If you conflate those together, then it's sort of makes it much more difficult to be courageous, right? But if you can say, hey, look, I understand that you believe what you believe, and I respect that you stand up for what you stand up for. I just have a different perspective about what you stand for.
Yeah.
Then we're having a very different conversation than you're a liar and a cheat and a scoundrel. And, oh, by the way, I disagree with you.
You don't care about anybody.
Right. All of that.
Yeah.
Right. Those things all come into play in that regard. So
that's courage. And then there's one more.
Right. The last one's care for people. And much like competence, it has two components to it. Right. And so those two components are fairly simple. Personal care for people and professional care for people. Personal care for people, very simply stated, can be a little difficult to put into place. And it is simply, do you treat everybody with respect and dignity? Everybody. Even those that you vehemently disagree with. Do you treat them with respect and dignity or not, right? Christ is a phenomenal example of this, right? Disagreed fundamentally with all kinds of things that he encountered and saw, right? But treated people with respect, treated them with dignity, told them the truth, back to courage, right? Had the care and respect for people to tell them the truth in love, right? When the word talks about truth in love, that's what we're talking about here, right? Is do you treat people with respect and dignity? Every single person, well, even those you most
it's not what you said, it's how you said it.
Yeah, right. And just how you treat me, right? Do you keep that character and a courage assessment separate, right? Yeah. So that's the first part, and that one, I actually think that's one where, from a credibility perspective, it's easier to be credible in this domain than it ever has been because people are so terrible at doing it. The world around us has gotten so far away from treating people with respect and dignity.
So the last place I was a pastor at, I took he was an older volunteer. He was, he was older.
Yeah.
Great guy. Took him out to breakfast just to spend time with him.
Yeah.
We're like halfway through breakfast and he says, so how come you brought me here? Like, what do you need?
Oh, yeah.
I was like, I don't need anything.
Yeah. I just want to hang out with you.
I just want to spend time with you. And he's like, serious?
Yeah.
I was like, yeah. He's like, I've been at this church for 15 years. He's like, no one's ever done that for me before.
Ever. Right.
Ever.
Right.
And I was like, really?
Yeah.
Like, why?
Yeah.
I don't understand. And this is a conversation for another time. But when it comes, like, I feel like this one ties a lot into presence as well.
Sure.
With caring for people and being present.
Yes.
And it feels like a lot of times high-end leaders
Right.
don't have the time of day for people because they're always on to the next thing.
They can. That's right.
And so I guess I would sometimes I think, well, I must be a terrible high-end leader because I care too much for everybody that I'm around.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to disconnect from the people.
I think that's a great gift, right?
So what's
skill.
the balance there? How do you be a high-end leader and manage all of these things?
Right.
And yet at the same time be able to give people presence.
Right.
Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I think it's easy to describe. For some, it can be difficult to do. It's be fully present and be sort of treat them fully with respect and dignity, no matter what happens. The phrase that I think of is, right, you often get a real glimpse into people's character and into their care for people by how they treat the people from whom they have the least to gain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? We're respectful, we're kind to people that we need. We're respectful, we're kind to people that can do things for us. What really shows your true colors is how do you treat the person that has absolutely nothing to gain, or from whom you have absolutely nothing to gain, right? Our pastor Stephen, I think, is a fabulous example of this, right? His heart, it's all over his heart, is to be there and help other people and support people, regardless of what it means for growing the church or what it means for him personally, right? He said from the platform this past week, right? Like, look, I'm not trying to get you to come to our church. I want you to know the Lord. I want you to have a relationship. I want to tell you the good news of the gospel. Whether you come to our church or not, that's less important to me. That's a powerful demonstration, in my opinion, of the sort of true heart, care for people, and it's a character reflection too, right? I mean, if I say what matters most is your relationship with the Lord and how I behave is, well, that's only true if you come to my church. That's different than, hey, I don't care. I just want you to be in relationship with God. Where you do that, I don't care. I just care about telling you the truth and helping you get there. So the example you talked about, sort of high level leaders. One of my clients was a leader at a private equity firm. Right, this is a guy that's worth, I don't know, north of $300 million. And I go to meet him in his high rise in New York, and I stop. There's a security guard in the lobby, right? So I talk to the security guard. His name is James. I happen to, I'm like, oh, James, I'm talking to him, et cetera, et cetera. He says, who are you going to see? I'm going to see so-and-so. I won't say his name. And he said, oh, you tell him I said hello. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Security guard is telling me to say hey to the $300 million guy. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And so I go up to meet, and guy comes in, I say hello, right? And I said, oh, hey, by the way, James from security says hello. Mm-hmm. And he says, oh, hey, you tell him such and such on the way out. Yeah. It's very clear to me that those two guys have a relationship with one another where they treat each other as equals with respect. Yeah. It's the security guard and the guy that's worth $300 million. Yeah. It was a powerful demonstration to me of he treats people with respect and dignity. Yeah. Does James at security, does he have anything to gain by taking care of James in security? Probably not. Does it matter? No.
Maybe
That's who he is.
Maybe security?
Maybe a little, right? But he's still going to do.
Sure.
He's still going to do his job, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
But so that's what it looks like, right? And that, for me, that's the yardstick. Yeah. How do you treat people from whom you have the least to gain? Yeah. Do you treat them the same as the people that you desperately need to like you and need something from? Just be kind. Just be respectful. Just treat people with dignity. Period. Regardless of what they think, regardless of how they treat you, regardless of whether you have something to gain from them. That's what care for people from the personal perspective looks like. And then finally, professional care for people gets a little bit back to what we talked about managerial competence, right? Do you know how to set expectations, et cetera? I'm a sport fan, and I'm a coach. And so I pay attention to coaches. And there are two things that when you study the pinnacle of coaching in whatever you're in, whether that's the violin teacher and coach, whether it's a basketball coach, whether it's a football coach, whatever, you ask the followers of those coaches, what is it about them that made them the best? And they say two things, and it's abundantly clear what those two things are. The first is, they believed in me almost more than I believed in myself. They pushed me harder than I thought I could go. Yeah. They had ridiculously high standards. Two, they would do anything for me. They loved me, supported me, coached me, taught me, and even after I stopped playing for them in the athletic example, I had a friend for life, right? That's what professional care for people looks like. The example I'll use there, right, is we've all had somebody in our lives, whether it was a professor, might have been your second grade teacher, might have been a Sunday school teacher, might have been your mom or dad, that let you get by with less than your best. Mm-hmm. And initially, that was awesome. Yeah. Right? Your initial impression of that person was, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're honest with yourself, what you thought over time was, does this person really care about me? Because they have to know that I'm not giving my best and they're letting me slide. And that was initially great. But what it really tells me is they don't actually care about me being good. And so as leaders, we can fall into the trap of, I need everybody to like me. I want everybody to sort of be part of it, et cetera. What professional care for people looks like is, don't be afraid to set high standards for people and then help them, do everything you can to help them be as awesome as they possibly can. Yeah. But it starts with those really, really high expectations.
I was thinking of my high school English teacher who, everyone hated her at the beginning of the year because she was so strict.
Right.
And she set her rules, and if you broke the rules, there was no wiggle room.
That's right.
By the end of the year, favorite teacher.
Right.
Everybody loved her.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And she even would bend the rules a little bit at the end of the year.
That's right.
Once the standard was met,
right,
it was like, okay, now we can come down. But if you make the standard down low, it's hard to raise it up.
That's exactly right.
And so you have to start high and then give grace, as opposed to starting low and then trying to push
no question about it. Yeah, no question about it. So that's what the care for people piece looks like, right? Do you treat everybody, no matter who they are, whether they disagree with you, whether they don't, with respect and dignity, frankly, regardless of how they treat you? Mm-hmm. Our Lord is a great example of that. Mm-hmm. And then do you have really high standards for people? Mm-hmm. And then do you help them be awesome? Yeah. And that's what professional care for people looks like. Those are sort of the 5 C's.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, John, it was so good to have you here. John Streitmatter.
Yeah, there it is. You know how to say it now.
Didn't that make you feel good? I knew your name,
See, you were paying attention. You were present.
That was a little credibility deposit for you.
You demonstrated the courage to say it at the end. Yeah,
that's right. Well, credibility is so important, and I hope that as you were listening today that you're able to learn a little bit, and definitely there's so much here for you to unpack. If somebody wants more information on just leadership and what you do, is there somewhere that they can go?
So certainly they can reach out to the resources at our website, www.lri.com, stands for Leadership Research Institute. Yep. They can email me at john.streitmatter@lri.com. I'll be happy to respond to any direct inquiries. Yeah. Remember, it's STREIT. Yeah. Even though it sounds like,
look for the name in the description.
Streitmatter.
It's there.
Look for the name in the description.
That's right.
Be happy to awesome. Respond by email, and hope we've been helpful by talking about this sort of highly durable,
Yeah.
Very actionable.
Yes.
Hopefully easy to understand concept
Absolutely.
of the 5 C's and the credibility bank account.
Yep. Remember, everywhere that you go, you are either gaining or losing credibility in everything that you do. And I just want to remind you that you are a leader. No matter what you are doing, no matter where you are, you have influence over somebody. And so take the time to think about, how am I utilizing that influence? Am I doing it for the greater good, for the good of the world? Are you doing it to build the kingdom of God? Are you not paying attention to it at all?
Right.
So all of those things. So thank you guys so much for listening. Again, we have a new episode releasing every single Wednesday. This is the Strong by Design podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the Strong by Design podcast. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe so that more people can find out about our show. Plus, you don't want to miss any future episodes with the amazing guests and topics we have lined up for you.